Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this online seminar provocatively entitled Venezuela's Hunger Bonds. My name is Pierre Schlosser, and it is an honor and a pleasure to introduce and moderate today's seminar with Mitu Gulati. Mitu is professor of law at Duke University, although he's based today in Florida, but he will explain, and the scientific organizer of our annual conference for a few years now. We've also with Jeromin Zettelmeyer from the Washington-based Peterson Institute for International Economics, who is a recurrent participant to our activities. Jeromin, Mitu, thank you for being with us, and our special thanks for waking up early, so early actually today. I'm certain that I'm not the only one to be very keen to understand what exactly is going on in Venezuela those days, both in terms of economics and politics. Our dear participants will have noticed this year's online seminars will have a broader thematic focus than our series of last year, so stay tuned and open to surprises. As you may know, the Florence School of Banking and Finance is a recent program of the European University Institute. The EUI is a postgraduate public and international research and education institute located in Florence, Italy. It offers PhD programs in social sciences since 1972 and more recently has added executive education courses to its portfolio of activities. As an executive education and policy dialogue platform, the Florence School of Banking and Finance is a place of debate, learning, and exchange, a place where the new and the older generation meet to discuss and argue about cutting-edge topics of financial stability, risk management, as well as recent issues of banking regulation, supervision, and resolution. All this for Europe's common good. Therefore, on top of our annual conference, our online seminars, and our closed-doors executive seminars, we offer numerous executive training courses every year in residential, in-house, and online formats. The more than 1,000 experts who we have trained so far are mostly active in European institutions and agencies or are part of European national central banks. But not only, as we notice an increasing interest for our activities in Asia and Latin America. Looking ahead, we have several residential courses coming up next, one which will be taught precisely by Mitu and Jeromin alongside Lee Buchheit in late April. That will be on sovereign debt risks and restructuring. Moreover, we'll have a course on the basic concepts of financial stability in mid-February, a training course on banking resolution in late February, which will be followed by an advanced course on macroprudential policy. A training session on the supervisory review and evaluation process with EBA, Hello Safka, will follow after Easter, and several other training courses are already lined up until the summer. As you can see, there will be a good mix of introductory, intermediate, and advanced courses, as well as theoretical and practice-oriented courses. So stay tuned and do not wait too long to register. Okay, now having said all that, let me switch gear and reach out to you, the audience, you in front of your computer, tablet, smartphone, at work or at home. You are around 60 participants today, following us from everywhere in Europe and the world. 35 nationalities are represented. Most of you, as you will imagine, are from Europe, but time and again, we're very glad to also welcome participants from South Africa, from Venezuela, from Argentina, and from the People's Republic of China. This fantastic diversity of participants has been summarized in our world crowd. May I give you, on top of this, a few more details? Well, 38% of you are women, 62% are men. Moreover, you have around 6 years of professional experience on average. Most of you are trained economists, but we also host participants with a law and business background, amongst others. Lastly, most of you have a master's degree, while 25% of you have a PhD and 11% a bachelor degree. Right. So how we will be structuring this online seminar? Well, Mitu will first provide us with a 20-minute presentation. Like always, this presentation will be punctuated by polls where you will be asked to provide your anonymous views on a given issue. To ensure that you have sufficient time to share your views, we'll then immediately move over then to the question and answers session, during which both Mitu and Jeromin will engage with your comments and questions. And I forgot to add that clearly after Mitu's presentation, Jeromin will step in for his comments. Let me stop here, disappear, and leave the floor to Mitu first and then to Jeromin. Mitu, I'll now ask you to connect your camera and mic, and then in the second step to share them with the platform, while I will tune back in for the Q&A later on. So Mitu, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. So I will start out by giving you a little bit of background on why I think this is one of the most exciting problems in the world of sovereign debt, what the connection is to the European context, both historically and today, and then give you a sense of the data that Ugo and I found very interesting. So the sort of the empirical part of this that we're just beginning is part of a project that I'm doing with Ugo Panizza, who is one of Jeromin's co-authors and one of the prominent voices in sovereign debt. So all errors, of course, belong to Ugo and Jeromin, and I am just articulating their views in a simplistic fashion. So let me start out with the basic question that has been around for a long time. Now, Pierre very kindly and correctly talked about sort of the provocative title. Now, it's not provocative because I came up with it, but it is an important part of the story. It's provocative in what it says and what its meaning is. And one of the big questions that I'm interested in asking, and that I would greatly appreciate yours and Jeromin's feedback, is whether or not the title itself did a lot of work in what happened with the Venezuelan debt situation, in particular with this one bond. And I'll try to tell you the story in terms of what happened as far as we could see from the outside. So, all right. Now, as many of you undoubtedly know, since you've been following the financial news and some of you are actively involved in the financial industry, Venezuela has been in one of the most spectacular sovereign debt free falls that we've ever seen in history. And it has a huge debt stock, mostly owed externally, that has been estimated as somewhere between 100 billion and 150 billion, and I'm being conservative. There are estimates closer to 200 billion, in part because Venezuela has borrowed in so many different forms and has been in deep crisis for at least 2 years. And when I say deep crisis, I mean that the sort of 6-month CDS spreads have been suggesting a probability of default between about 75% and 95% for 2 years, which is an incredibly long time to sit in this near almost default stage without actually defaulting and restructuring, which means, in a different way, the country, in order to function on a daily basis, for which it needs external finance, has been borrowing at a very, very high rate. So the rates, for those of you who are in the market, you know, is sort of upwards of 35% per annum on what they're borrowing. Now, for over 2 years, those of us who work in the restructuring business and think about techniques of restructuring, which I see Jeromin and I both do this as our academic work, have been thinking of restructuring is coming, and coming any day. And every time we've thought it's coming next week or the week after because Venezuela has some big payment that they have to make, it hasn't come because either they did, some kind of sneaky borrowing that we'll talk about, or they got financing from the Chinese or the Russians or some other external party. So Venezuela has sort of been struggling along, and it is fairly unique in terms of the types of countries that go bust, in that it is so incredibly rich in terms of natural resources. It has, I think, the largest oil reserves in the world, basically comparable to Saudi Arabia. So ordinarily you would think this is not a country that would go into crisis. Now, one of the classic old questions in sovereign debt that has been around for at least 100 years is the question of whether or not the nature of the regime matters to whether debt has to be repaid. What we mean by this is whether or not the guys who borrowed the debt were good guys or bad guys. So you take a despot like Saddam Hussein, who borrowed money. A lot of his money was borrowed in order to finance arms purchases, to finance corruption, things like that. The question is whether or not the successor government that is often the democratic, anti-despot government that comes into place has to pay back the debts that were incurred, often to hurt them. Now, this is directly relevant in the Venezuelan case, or at least the question is being asked in the Venezuelan case, because the current regime in Venezuela, the Maduro regime, has been condemned by a large part of the world as illegitimate. And so it has been, sanctions have been imposed on it by the Americans, by the Canadians, and by the European Union. And they have specifically said this is an illegitimate government. But what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of Venezuela's borrowing? And for our purposes, the question I want to ask is, what does it mean in terms of the likelihood of getting repaid? So do the people who lent to the Maduro regime, particularly after the Maduro regime in effect sort of neutered the current legislature, do they have a lower chance of getting repaid than the people who lent to prior regimes that, let us just say for the argument, were not as bad as the current regime? Now, as a matter of international law, this old question that academics and policymakers and activists keep asking has a simple answer, and has always had this simple answer, which is the nature of the regime is irrelevant. You have to pay it regardless. So one of the most extreme examples of this was the debt of the apartheid era government in South Africa that the ANC government paid in full. Now, there were questions as to whether or not they should make the legal claim, but it was analyzed in great detail, and they decided ultimately that the legal basis was not strong enough, and for reputational reasons they should pay. Now, for over 100 years, it's not just lawyers and activists who've been arguing about it, but even the hard-nosed economists like our friends Jeromin and Ugo have thought that there might be arguments in favor of changing the legal regime, in part having to do with incentives. You don't want to give bad governments an incentive to stay in power longer, and one thing that gives them incentives to stay in power longer is the ability to borrow on the financial markets. If that debt wouldn't get repaid, then the incentive to borrow on the financial markets goes down quite a bit, right? And that's what potentially we see in Venezuela. So that's sort of the core of the theoretical part of what I want to talk to you. And now I'll quickly go through some of the data, and then hopefully Jeromin can sort of shed light on this, as he always does, since he is really, the guru of this field and has been for the last 20 years or so. All right. What happened? The key event that happened had to do with Professor Ricardo Hausmann, who, for those of you who work in this business, know is a legend. But what Ricardo did on May 26, 2007, is he published a blog post on Project Syndicate where he said investors buying bonds of Venezuela are doing harm to the people of Venezuela because people are starving there. There's basically a humanitarian crisis. So to the extent you are financing the government, and this was an important point that he made, to the extent the government has to use its money to pay back bondholders, they are in effect causing the humanitarian crisis to get worse. And he said, we should call these hunger bonds. It wasn't his provocative title. He actually took it from a Twitter feed, I believe, from one of the opposition members. But he put it in his blog post on the hunger bonds and called them, and it's the effect of that was so spectacular. Now, a couple of days later, the press reported that Goldman Sachs had just bought $2.8 billion in PDVSA bonds. PDVSA, for those of you who don't know, is the state-owned oil company that basically runs Venezuela, or at least generates 95% plus of its foreign revenues. And this purchase of $2.8 billion in bonds was done at a deep face value discount. So about $865 million, as best I could figure out. So it said on its face $2.8 billion, but it was actually $865 million that they paid. And the legal implications of this is something that we can talk about a little bit. But what happened immediately after the blog post, both in terms of the prices and in terms of the public reaction, was quite spectacular. Immediately, we saw protests outside Goldman Sachs offices around the world, but particularly in New York, where people picked up on Ricardo Hausman's term, the hunger bonds, and started protesting about what Goldman had done. And the opposition in Venezuela also picked up on this and sent public letters to the various banks saying, we think this is outrageous. And I have a quote in there from Julio Borges about, sort of the core of what he was saying. We think this is outrageous, and we will investigate it and potentially not pay it. Now, here's a little picture of one of my favorite protests out there. They were actually, I went to one of these because I was curious about what people knew. As best I could tell from talking to people, they really had no idea about any of the legal issues involved, as you might expect. But they did all sort of uniformly agree that Goldman Sachs sucked. So sorry to my friends at Goldman Sachs. They sort of inadvertently seem to have gotten into this buzzsaw. Now, if you think about it from a legal perspective, and let me take you back to the slides to the quote from Borges. He says, given the unconstitutional nature of Nicolas Maduro's administration, its unwillingness to hold democratic elections, and its systematic violation of human rights, I am dismayed that Goldman Sachs decided to enter this transaction. This, in a sense, is the worst stuff that he says about them and about these bonds. That is, under international law, not a violation. So I can lend to Saddam Hussein. The successor government, excuse me, has to pay those debts back. Relative to Saddam, Maduro is actually highly democratic, one might say, based on the conditions under which he entered into power. So I wouldn't think ordinarily that statements like this would have any effect. But let's see what happened. All right, I don't know if you can see the dates on the spread increasing, but what you will see is, if you look at basically the first couple of lines, you will see how the yields skyrocketed after Hausman's Project Syndicate blog post. They skyrocket to an extent that is really dramatic if you follow the effect of legal risk on sovereign bonds. So it's about 400 to 500 basis points that it goes up to initially, like that, just the bump up, right? So the bond is issued at a 400 basis point premium over the other bonds, other equivalent oil company bonds, and then the blog post comes out and really kills it. So it's easier to see on the graph that I'll show you next. So the hunger bond, and interestingly, When Ricardo talks about this in his blog post, he's not talking about any specific bond. He's just talking about investors in Venezuela generally. But it gets interpreted one day later as being about this specific bond that Goldman Sachs purchases. And now you see the effect on the market, right, for about 30 days. And this, if you take it on faith, for those of us who study sovereign bond yields and think about what things it affected, the most important contract provision in a sovereign bond is arguably a provision called the collective action clause. It's the clause that allows for restructurings to happen, and it sets out the mechanism for how they happen. And importantly, people talk about the question of whether or not it requires the unanimous votes of the creditors, 100% vote, or just a supermajority, which might be something between 75% or 85%. Obviously, as you can see, if it requires unanimity, it's very hard to restructure. Now, the difference between a 100% bond and a 75% bond for Venezuela is generally between 7 and 2 basis points. The effect of this blog post by Ricardo Hausmann is 500 basis points. And this is a bond that is actively followed by the market. Venezuela, in part because it's in such deep distress and because investors can make such high profits on investing in it, is of great interest, and it's followed a lot. Right? So I'm going to shut down just in maybe a few seconds, if not minutes, and turn it over to Jeromin, because I've shown you most of what is interesting. I have more data slides, but they just make this point more emphatically. So I'll just show you one more slide about this. Notice this, the giant jump. As we go some months later, this big difference in pricing largely disappears. Right? You see the yields as we spread it out get closer and closer. Now, you might ask, what's happening? And the story seems to be that the likelihood of the Maduro government being kicked out of power goes down dramatically. There's a new election. It's argued to be fraudulent, but the opposition gets fractured, and bondholders figure he's going to stay in power for much longer than we expected. And so therefore, this contaminated hunger bond that Goldman Sachs purchased is probably going to be okay. Now, let me go to implications and then turn it over to Jeromin. I think the big implication and the big question I have is, does the story of the hunger bonds, about how a professor at Harvard writing a blog post could dramatically increase the cost of capital for a bad regime, does that have lessons for us about how this forcing the cost of capital to be increased for bad regimes could be done in the future? Right? And I should leave it with that for Jeromin to talk about, and then we can come back. Thank you.
So basically, I'm going to try and sort of summarize my understanding of what Mitu said and why he likes this case so much, and then try and develop some implications. And by doing that, I'm actually going to get into a little more into the interpretation that Mitu kept rather short. So Mitu has started writing up a paper about this, which fortunately I was able to see. And so I'm cheating in a way, because I know the bit of the paper that he didn't present in any great detail, but maybe he can, I suppose he will elaborate on that at the end. So let me give you what I think of as the general storyline. So basically the first step in the argument is that, you know, we all feel morally that there is something to the odious debt doctrine, so that it would be a very good thing morally, and even in a broader sense, perhaps economically, if the debts of odious regimes, of really bad regimes, could not be enforced, in the sense that they would not be repaid by their successors, because that would mean that odious regimes would have a far narrower scope to do odious stuff, right? I mean, they wouldn't get financed to engage in, large-scale expenditure increases that ultimately result in crisis, for example, or that result in military buildup that are used to finance wars, or that are simply stolen by the regime and its cronies. And so, if we had an effective way of implementing this doctrine, it would effectively provide a form of political market discipline, right? Economists love market discipline, and so we would be extending the empire of market discipline to other areas, that arguably matter a lot more than whether a country just runs a 3% deficit or a 5% deficit. Okay, so it's sort of the economist's dream to get this odious debt doctrine to work in a sense. Now, the problem with this is that if you think about a straightforward way of implementing this, then any new government could refuse to pay the debts of the previous government on the grounds that the previous government's was bad, and in that case we wouldn't have any debt at all. Okay, so that's the big problem, and hence we would be over punishing. And debt become too expensive, or it wouldn't exist. And this is what motivates this rule of government succession, as Mitu I think called it, which is completely hard, no exceptions. One government is the legal successor of another and has to repay. Okay, now the reason Mitu is so interested in this hunger bonds episode is because it seems to provide an example for a possible alternative or for a possible avenue of enforcing the odious debt doctrine, which may be possible without a major change in legal doctrine. And that is, if you like, pure crowd enforcement of the doctrine. So I view it as a little bit similar to, say, environmental standards being enforced by just consumer outrage. I mean, think of fair trade labels, right? Think of how coffee producers were basically forced to adopt not coffee producers, but coffee distributors in the West were forced to adopt higher standards in terms of how they remunerate and treat their growers, because essentially consumers forced them to, right? They started discriminating between coffee products depending on what they knew, not about the quality of the coffee, which would be sort of analogous to risk and return of bonds, the primary attribute of the good, but how the coffee actually is produced. And this arguably has been effective in raising standards that otherwise you would have had to raise through direct policies in the countries in which the coffee is produced, right? So you have this nice substitutive relationship. In a sense, you make up for the lack of effective institutions and legal framework by the collective force of outrage. Okay, and something like this seems to have gone on in the hunger bonds episode that Mitu described, and this is why it is so fascinating. Now, there is a problem with this, however, and to put it in sort of one populist line, greedy bankers tend to be a lot more callous than coffee drinkers. So we have very strong incentives in financial markets that tend to lead prices to be set really primarily based on financial characteristics, right? So risk and return. And so there's a sort of a real issue of whether this might work, whether market discipline can be actually provided based purely on outrage without having behind it this additional element that actually the reason why prices and yields do react on a particular bond is not primarily the outrage, but the sense that this particular bond is actually going to be more likely to suffer a default, right? And so the problem with the hunger bond episode is that while it provides evidence that public outrage matters, the fact that it matters differentially, so that it didn't strike like the Venezuelan bonds in general, but this particular bond also lends evidence to the interpretation or credence to the interpretation that what is really going on there is that investors feared that, you know, because these bonds had gotten so much publicity and because the opposition, which had actually called for boycotts of, if I understand correctly, Mitu can nod if this is right, they had called for generic boycotts of public debt issued by the Maduro regime. However, after this episode, they called for specific boycotts of the hunger bond. And so it made this hunger bond sort of, if you like, look like the prime target of a default. And maybe in the context of all the outrage in this specific case, that was credible. But if one is to do this more systematically, one still needs, if you like, a framework by which it is less likely that repayment of bonds issued by odious regimes can be enforced than by non-odious regimes. Okay, so even the hunger episode, because of this differential impact, ultimately can be construed as providing evidence that it is the fear of default that matters, right? It is the ease, the relative higher likelihood that these bonds would be not serviced relative to the other bonds that matters. And so, you know, one sort of negative take on Mitu's evidence is that, you know, while it provides evidence that public outrage can have an effect, the specific way in which this evidence played out actually confirms the point that you need a, you know, if you're going to harness this in a systematic way, you need a legal framework that actually weakens the chances of enforcing repayment of debt issued by bad regimes. And so, in a sense, we are back to square one. Now, Mitu, surprisingly, in his talk, didn't tell you that he also has a solution. I guess he wanted to force me to explain his solution for this in the back part of the paper, and so I'm gonna try and explain what he actually proposes to do in terms of policy based on this. So my overall reading is that, yeah, this is a nice episode, but it doesn't actually show that, you know, outrage works in a vacuum. Okay, you need to create a legal framework to make outrage productive. And so the workaround that Mitu and Ugo propose is that one should change the law in the main sovereign debt issuing jurisdictions. I'm sorry, in the main sovereign law governing jurisdictions such as New York, London, and so forth, to penalize not odious regimes per se, because then you have this whole tangle with the succession problem, but rather you focus on circumstances in which these bonds were issued, and you particularly have changes in these legal frameworks that say that if bonds are issued either in circumstances that involve corruption or that bypass domestic law approval, so the law of the actual issuer, whatever that domestic law may be, whatever that issuer may be. So, you know, this could be an industrial country, it could be Venezuela, it could be China, it could be anything. Then this bond issue may not be enforceable, right? So that is fundamentally the solution. And so rather than focusing, so the trick that he's proposing, that they're proposing, if I understand it correct, is rather than focus on the odious nature of the regime itself, you focus on attributes that, you know, are plausible from a broader range of legal perspectives than just the odious debt doctrine, but that tend to be correlated with odious regimes, right? So you get at them indirectly at these regimes. And the crucial thing of why this might fly, again, I'm really speculating, Mitu, you should have presented this, okay, is that this type of legal change might not be in conflict with the doctrine of government succession, okay? Because all you're doing really is saying if there are significant irregularities in the actual issuance process, there's no real reason to pay this money back. Okay, now I think it's kind of cool, but I don't think it will work for the following reason. I mean, the essence here of the idea, the reason why it may not conflict with government succession is that you are really removing it from the nature of the regime per se, but this also has a big problem, which is that the types of criteria that Mitu wants to focus are criteria that potentially can be controlled even by very odious regimes, right? So if you think of a sort of Nazi type odious regime, right? So, you know, this is not a regime that was internally particularly chaotic, right? Quite the contrary. This is a regime that was able to actually discipline its main members in a very effective way. You know, you can argue there was corruption at a very grand level somewhere, but there wasn't all that much petty corruption. And as far as domestic law approvals are concerned, that ran like clockwork, right? So if you have a sort of what you might call a disciplined, odious regime, they could easily bypass all this stuff. So, you know, it's one of these cases where, although Mitu is quite right that, you know, if you take a broad cross-section of cases, you would find a correlation of these criteria with odious regimes. Once you put this into law, odious regimes are likely to change their behavior to no longer be, you know, vulnerable to this potential change in the law by avoiding the circumstances which make it easier for these bonds to be challenged, for the repayment of these bonds to be challenged. And so I think we're kind of maybe not quite back to square one, because we've learned a lot in the process, but we are back, I think, to having to search for a solution that is really focused on objective criteria that either define odious governments or are correlated but cannot be influenced by odious governments. So I think we're really back to this thing that we need to define egregious behavior.
Okay, so Jeromin articulated the key problem much better than I could have, and the question of the solution. So let me now explicate a little bit more of both the legal considerations at the domestic level in Venezuela and the pricing results that we see in terms of the analysis. So first, Jeromin's exactly right, as he unfortunately almost always is, in that what we see with the hunger bonds is what I emphasize to you, because I'm trained as a lawyer to make arguments. I emphasize to you the part that helped my argument, which was the spectacular differential in the hunger bond price versus the other comparable bonds. I mean, they're beautifully comparable in terms of maturity and legal structure and everything else. But if you push out the data further, and then you do those things that economists do, you know, you run regressions where you control for everything. After about 6 months, the differential completely disappears. So, you know, Jeromin could have said, yeah, yours is a cute story about 6 months that were completely irrelevant. And after 6 months, the press stopped talking about the hunger bonds, and the protesters went away to protest something else, something about Trump or some porn star or something like that, and then the prices just merged. So your story is really not a big story. Now, in the background, and this did not affect the price, is what I think could be more interesting and could give us a solution. But I'm completely speculating here. What happened because of this hunger bond? So now let's go back to the specifics of the hunger bond. The hunger bond was an issuance of roughly $3 billion. Officially, it's about $3 billion. Goldman Sachs bought $2.8 billion of it. Now, they thought, or at least they say they thought, and I believe what they say, they thought they were buying it on the secondary market at a deep discount. Actually, if we see what happened to Venezuela's capital reserves almost instantaneously, is that Venezuela was issuing it on the primary market, but making it seem like a secondary market transaction. Now, this is important in financial terms and legal terms because what you're doing is you're artificially increasing the principal amount and reducing the interest rate. So the bond, in actuality, in yield to maturity terms, had a rate of about 40% or something like that, something in that vicinity. The official rate was 6%. The reason they did this was to artificially increase the principal. And the reason you artificially increase the principal is if the person doing the lending is very close to default. And in the default, there's not going to be enough money to pay everybody. The way we decide who gets paid how much is a function of principal. It's not a function of how much interest hasn't been paid. Now, if you know this, and you're sneaky, and you are lending money to somebody who's near default, you will artificially increase your principal and reduce your interest rate. Now, nobody had really paid attention to this before Ricardo Hausmann started writing about hunger bonds, and he wasn't writing about this, and before Goldman Sachs got into trouble with the protesters, we hadn't paid any attention to this. But once this happened, and it caused us to pay attention, us meaning people who work on this, we realized Venezuela has been doing this kind of stuff all over the place. And it's not just this bond, but lots of other bonds. And this sort of principal interest manipulation is a legal violation. It is a legal violation in almost every country and every country's bankruptcy system. Once we unraveled that, we began to realize there were other legal issues with a lot of this stuff. So in a sense, the public protesters, even if they didn't know what they were doing, they sort of unraveled or forced us to look at stuff that we don't normally look at. Now, I think my sense is that most odious regimes, most bad regimes, are somewhat incompetent. They're bad in part because they don't function well. And so there will be lots of bad stuff with what they're doing that you don't need a new doctrine of international law to get at. Jeromin's point correctly is if they are really, really bad, like the Nazi regime, then they're going to be good at being bad. And they're not going to make these mistakes. So he is exactly right. We wouldn't catch them. But we would catch a lot of the sort of not as horribly bad, but medium bad countries. Maybe. Again, if they could adjust their behavior to just be, highly competent at being bad, then what I'm suggesting wouldn't happen. But the reality is we haven't been able to come up with a solution to this for over a century. We've been struggling with it. So this may have given us some hope. So that's sort of what I wanted to say. And I was fascinated by the survey results from the online survey, which is that the vast majority of you seem to think that countries should not have to pay back the debts of despotic regimes, which is what we would expect. And yet, law, which usually reflects perceptions and public views, and you are probably more conservative than the general public, does not have any avenue for this. All right, I should give it back to Jeromin, and then we should open it up.
Let's just change environment and give a chance to our participants already to formulate their questions in the chat box. And give the floor to Jeromin for a quick reply, please.
I agree. So I had sort of the usual knee-jerk economist reaction, moral hazard, and whatever loopholes there are will be exploited by the bad regimes. But I basically agree that this is not a completely clean solution, but it would be an important step forward. It would catch a lot of what Mitu calls the incompetent bad regimes, which may be the majority, and then we need a separate solution for the rationally bad ones.
Since I see that people are typing, Mitu, would you like to react quickly to the coffee comparison, which I found quite interesting on this idea of a sort of fair bond label, if I understand correctly?
Jeromin is right, and I normally don't like this. I don't think protesters who don't really understand what they're doing are a good way for the international financial markets to be penalized or rewarded. That sounds terrible to me. But this is a problem that we have not gotten traction on forever, and it's a rare problem on which everybody in the public space and academic space seems to agree. What we disagree about is the implementation. What we agree about is that bad regimes should be disincentivized from being bad. And as a historical matter, we know that bad regimes show up regularly. And one of the things they like to do is borrow on the international markets because they are bad, so they can't easily tax their people. So for me, in one sense, this is always a marginal problem because it's too hard to solve. And when we're working on real country restructurings, inevitably we have to put this to aside and focus on the real, negotiations which can't talk about these moral issues. But intellectually and from the world's perspective more generally, I think it's sad we haven't figured out a solution to this. So, that's really, I think Jeromin and I know we both find it fascinating, but we probably wouldn't spend a huge chunk of our lives doing it because what we're often more interested in is today's problems rather than the problem that might be solved, after we're both dead.
Okay, there is a question about the sharing of your draft paper, which I'll let you answer, Mitu, and then a question by Diogo on the kind of criteria that you would propose to qualify a sovereign bond as unenforceable.
All right, so the paper, Jeromin was being optimistic in describing it as a paper. I always hope when I get Jeromin to get involved in this is the paper will get written because Jeromin will agree to write the crucial parts of the paper. So that's the whole hope. His criticisms are often the solution to my problems. But we will happily share the paper once we're done, hopefully in a few months. But the second question that Diego asked is a very good one. And I don't think, one of the things that Jeromin said that is not part of our goal is, he said that we're proposing legal reform. In a sense we are, but I don't want to change any law because I think the answer to some law professor saying we should change law is that nothing will happen. And I do care about things happening. So what I think we should pay attention to is whether or not bad regimes have violated their own laws. So every country in the world has laws saying you cannot incur debts or you cannot enter into contracts with other parties if you don't actually represent the people you're purporting to enter into contracts for. This is what is called agency law. You can't act as an agent for somebody unless you're actually their agent. Now, governments are agents of the people. That is not just a sort of philosophical and political conception, but it's a legal conception. That is why governments have to pay back the debts of prior governments. It's because each government is viewed as the agent for the same group of ever-changing people. Now, if you violate basic agency law because you're not representative, or in the case of Venezuela specifically, the issue is because you didn't get the legislative approvals that are necessary under Venezuelan law. So if you didn't do that, then you're just violating basic law, and it should be recognized by a court in New York that would have to enforce it to not be acceptable debt. So I'm not proposing, I'm saying that the criteria will be there for incompetent regimes. So Jeromin was right. If you're competent and you change all the criteria, then you won't find anything. But if you're either incompetent or you're not powerful enough to be able to change everything, then you will fall afoul of lots of rules. And I think we will see this when Venezuela restructures, and if the IMF is careful enough in parsing these debts, and if the current administration is in place, I suspect there will be people who have the incentives to parse. Then we will see this play out in real time in Venezuela within the next year or two.
Thanks, Mitu. I think that Jeromin had some time while listening to you also to multitask and read, for example, the question by Vasilis or Amarilis. Can you pick up one of the two?
Yeah,
Jeromin?
actually, maybe I can say quickly something about both. So I think Vasilis, I mean, the reason why we, there is a rationale to focus on odious debt in addition to perhaps generally making orderly debt restructuring easier, which I'm also in favor of, is just because of the specific problem that we are trying to solve with these with the treatment of odious debt, right? So we really would like market discipline, if you like, to become a tool for making it less easy to engage in egregious political behavior, and that is quite different from other reasons why you may want to have an orderly regime for sovereign debt restructuring, which I'm also in favor of. Now, Amaryllis makes the sort of the key point. I mean, basically, Amaryllis' point is the point I was trying to make. So contrary to what Pierre suggested, even though I like his suggestion, I named the fair label, fair working conditions, fair trade, or whatever label as an example, because I thought that for the reasons stated in Amaryllis' question, it would be hard to do in the context of sovereign debt, right? For exactly the reasons that you state, which is that the purchase decisions for coffee are controlled by retail consumers directly, by the end consumers, whereas the purchase decisions in sovereign debt are usually intermediaries, and they just focus on risk and return, right? Those are their incentives. And so you are quite right, there is this fundamental problem, which is why I suggested you need something else. And I was a little unclear on what that something else could be. So I actually thought that Mitu was suggesting that we change New York law and London law to make it more sensitive to the types of domestic violations that he said. But all he's saying is we should just get better at pointing out and exploiting those domestic violations within the current framework of the law, right? So this is but it's not a very big distinction. However, after Pierre made this fascinating suggestion that we should actually label, or we should have an NGO label sovereign bonds in terms of the odiousness of the issuer, on a scale from 0 to 5, like 5 is super odious, and 0 is whatever, some wonderful democracy. I think it's a great idea because even though retailers do not control the ultimate the purchase decision, they can exert pressure on the intermediaries they do, right? And so one particularly important intermediary that is subject to such pressure are sovereign wealth funds. So sovereign wealth funds are, in a sense, accountable to the broader public on a wider range of issues than just their returns. So I strongly endorse the labeling idea of Pierre. He was actually ahead of me on that. I think it could be made constructive.
I don't want to own that idea, but I heard it and reframed it, and you sort of expanded on it, which is very nice of you. But let's throw it out in the public. So we had a remark from Despina, which I think Mitu had a chance to have a look at, and then there was Sarah from Frankfurt. So perhaps Mitu, if you can react to Despina, and so Jeromin will have a chance to have a look at Sarah's question.
I think actually there is Sarah and Despina asked their question very politely, but if you look at New York cases, they could have asked it more rudely, because we know from the New York cases, especially the cases involving Iraq, where there was much more wrongdoing. So the Iraqi cases weren't about debt per se, they were really about violations of the oil for food program. But the New York court said, look, we know they're bad. We know that our own government has gone to war with them. We know there are lots of sanctions. But we're just not good at doing this stuff. We're not good at figuring out whether or not there are local violations, and so we're not going to do it. So in that sense, Jeromin is right. We would have to have some kick in the pants of the New York or London judges to get them to pay attention to this. So we also had in London just last year, or I think it was just last year, the case involving Ukrainian debt to Russia, where Russia had, gone in and one would think, under most estimations, taken a big chunk of Ukraine, and Ukraine couldn't get out of the debt on the basis of they took our country, or they took at least a big portion of our country, because the judge in London was like, this is just not what I do. I don't decide what happens when you take a portion of somebody else's country. I'm just a local judge enforcing contracts. So you guys are right. I mean, I am trying to minimize the size of what I'm actually proposing that happens in the world by saying, oh no, it's just really small and insignificant, and really I'm not changing anything, and you are forcing me to say that I'm asking for big changes. But change doesn't happen by saying you're asking for
there's
big
also
stuff.
the example
It
of
happens
Mozambique,
by saying you're doing
right?
nothing.
Which in a way is a precedent for what you're trying to suggest, because here we had illegally issued IOUs, which the government then refused to repay. Now this is the same government, so it's not sort of the succession of an odious regime, but it's the same idea that you exploit a weakness in the way how the stuff was issued. And this, I think, seems to work, right? Or what is the status of that case?
I think it does work. So this is part of, I think Jeromin and I have very different perspectives in one way, because the thing that I specialize in is finding loopholes and weaknesses to exploit, and Jeromin views the world as good and moralistic and rational, except for a few deviant players at the very extreme margins. And I think most of the world is full of errors and deviant players. And so I think there's always a way to find out ways to, catch them. And Jeromin thinks they will be able to adjust their behavior and everything will be loophole free. I'm exaggerating, but I think the difference in these views does impact how much you think you can do in situations like this.
Okay, I think there is Sarah's question, which is still unanswered at this stage, and then we could briefly discuss, because we had just a few minutes left, what the potential implications of the argument actually would be for Europe, because we didn't talk about Europe at all.
I think so. In the Venezuelan case is good for this loophole question that Sarah asked, which is that, in most regimes, despots can only stay in power if they have support from at least some of the population. And you can't, in order to have support from at least some of the population, you have to appear like you're doing at least something for them. So I think there are even in despotic regimes, there are built-in constraints about what you can do, until except when it goes completely off the rails. So in Venezuela, Maduro has a problem that he's stuck with a legislature, the National Assembly, that is run by the opposition. And he can't actually get rid of it completely, even though he's tried. And they pass laws and they issue statements and they do all sorts of stuff that interferes with his ability to borrow. And in a sense, that is part of the story of the hunger bonds, the letters from the opposition to the banks, and the opposition has arguably legitimate authority. So it's sort of interesting.
Thanks. Europe. Anyone?
So I'll let Jeromin take this, but it is the EU has imposed sanctions on Venezuela, so this is not a sort of, this is quite relevant, even if you don't think there will ever be a future European country that has these problems.
So, I mean,
Chairman?
one argument I think in favor of a Mitu solution is that we sometimes find that even disciplined odious regimes like to hold themselves to high standards for propaganda reasons that are then not actually adhered to in practice, right? So one example for that from the Cold War is that, you know, most countries in the former Soviet bloc had constitutions that held them to very high standards of human rights and democracy. And it was just the interpretation of what that meant that was very different in the West and in those countries themselves. So this is something I think that speaks in favor of Mitu's argument. So the difference in interpretation is something that can be exploited in this case to make enforcement of bonds where, you know, high standards have been violated less easy, so to make it basically easier not to repay those bonds. And the reason is that, of course, the standards are being interpreted by the Western judge here, right? And so governments that, you know, on paper commit to high procedures because this is part of the show that they need to keep up vis-a-vis their publics, could then see themselves in trouble if they don't actually make good on those procedures in the way they issue sovereign debt. And that, if you like, gets them on the hook because the person who is interpreting that is someone sitting in New York who is unlikely to be impressed by the propaganda. So that's sort of a hopeful line for me to think. Now, the question is, you know, to what extent is this relevant in the area of sovereign debt issues to the same extent that it would be in the area of human rights, for example. So that's not completely clear. But in any case, the more and more I think of it, the more I'm becoming convinced of Mitu's solution as one that can catch quite a lot. It can catch quite a lot. But again, like you said, Mitu, the judges need a kick in the back. Huh? But that I really do not think of as being so terrible, because it's, you know, if the kick in the back is something that does not involve a major change in doctrine that would have constituencies against it, it is something that I could imagine countries legislating, you know, just like Belgium legislated a protection of its payment system in response to the Elliott-Peru case, right? I mean, parliaments then suddenly wake up and they say, hey, you know, let's plug a loophole because some bad people are using it. I think that is quite plausible that, say, the New York State would legislate something that takes this a bit more seriously.
Ladies and gentlemen, this seminar is reaching its end. To make it formal, I found this to be a very exciting and stimulating moment. I'd like to warmly thank Jeromin and Mitu for their time and dedication, and all the participants for their question and for simply watching us. So more information on our upcoming online seminars will follow shortly. Stay tuned and see you soon. I wish you a very good, excellent afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone.